The first thing anyone would notice about the Reiner estate in Brentwood was its sheer size. A sprawling $13.5 million property, nestled among manicured gardens and high walls, it was the kind of home that promised safety, comfort, and an idyllic life. But appearances, as they so often do, can be deceiving. Because behind these grand gates, in what should have been a sanctuary of family, something utterly horrifying had happened. Something that would shock the nation, rip through the media, and leave a family shattered in ways almost impossible to imagine. What exactly occurred inside that opulent home? And why would a son, the very person entrusted with love and care, become the source of unspeakable tragedy? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. On a seemingly ordinary Sunday, Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found dead, stabbed. Not just once or twice, but in a manner so brutal that it defied comprehension. Their son, Nick, 32, who lived in the guest house on the same estate, was arrested that very night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The story itself was already shocking, but the details that emerged, particularly from Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, would add a layer of pain and horror that few could have anticipated. Romy's words, raw and unfiltered, captured a depth of grief that no one could ignore. Rob was not just killed, he was stabbed 100 times. He begged me for help. Imagine hearing something like that. Imagine hearing it from someone you consider family. Can you even process the sheer betrayal, the unimaginable fear, and the complete reversal of everything you thought you knew about your loved ones? These are the questions that haunt anyone reading about this case, and they are precisely the questions that will drive us through this story. But let's step back for a moment. Rob Reiner was not just a father. He was a husband, a man whose life spanned decades filled with personal and professional achievement. Michelle, his wife, shared not only a life but a legacy that intertwined with his. Together, they built more than a home. They built a family, a lineage, and a place that others admired. And yet, the very foundation of that family was shattered in a single night. The complexity of this story does not lie merely in the act itself, but in the layers of secrecy, tension, and unresolved conflict that surrounded it. Romy Reiner's statement to the media came with the kind of raw emotion that pulls you in and refuses to let go. She spoke of unimaginable pain, of the horrific and devastating loss, and of the circumstances that led to her father's final moments. "He begged me for help," she said, tears in her eyes. The repetition of the word begged is not incidental. It highlights a human truth that is almost unbearable. In the moments when intervention could have saved a life, help either could not or did not arrive. The idea that someone's final moments were filled with pleas that went unheard or unheeded is a concept that chills to the bone. And yet, even in the midst of this horror, there is a story to tell beyond the immediate tragedy. There is history, there is motive, there are small details that, when pieced together, begin to form a larger picture. This story is not only about a brutal act of violence. It is about a family, about trust betrayed, about secrets that festered behind closed doors. The story asks us to look at what we think we know about those closest to us, and to confront the uncomfortable reality that darkness can exist where we least expect it. The Brentwood estate itself becomes almost a character in this narrative. The very architecture, the carefully curated luxury, the quiet seclusion, all play into the unfolding events. On the surface, it was the picture of wealth and safety. Beneath that, it was the setting of something entirely unimaginable. How does a home that promises so much safety become the scene of such horror? That is a question that cannot be answered without delving into the personalities, relationships, and tensions that defined this family. Nick Reiner's role in all of this is complicated. He was the son, the young adult living in proximity to his parents, the person who should have been part of the family unit in a supportive way. Instead, he has become the focus of public scrutiny, the suspect in a case that is as much about psychology and family dynamics as it is about law enforcement. Arrested the night of the murders, charged with first-degree murder, his life has now become an emblem of what can go terribly wrong in even the most seemingly ordinary family structures. What led to this moment? What could drive a son to commit such a violent act against the very people who gave him life? These are not questions with simple answers, but we will explore them in detail. The public's reaction has been one of shock, horror, and a kind of morbid curiosity. Social media exploded with speculation, news outlets raced to cover every new detail, and neighbors shared accounts of a family that seemed, on the surface, normal and happy. But appearances, again, can be deceiving. Behind the gates, in private rooms, in conversations that were never meant to be overheard, there were tensions, conflicts, and potentially dangerous dynamics that no one outside the family could see. And now, tragically, the results of those hidden dynamics have been laid bare for the world to witness. As we continue to unfold this story, we will explore the layers that led to this catastrophic event. We will examine the last days of Rob and Michelle Reiner, tracing the timeline of what happened before that fateful Sunday. We will look into Nick Reiner's life, his relationships with his parents, and the possible motives that could have precipitated such a violent act. We will also focus on Romy Reiner's perspective, her grief, and the details she has courageously shared. Through all of this, our goal is not merely to recount events, but to understand them, to parse the emotional truth beneath the headlines. Consider for a moment the horror of a parent's final moments. Rob Reiner, pleading for help, faced a violent, inescapable reality. The idea that someone could be stabbed so many times, in what should have been a place of safety, challenges our basic assumptions about trust and family. How does a family, which the world admires for its stability, wealth, and outward success, descend into such tragedy? And how do we, as observers, reconcile the image of the family we thought we knew with the reality of what occurred? These are questions that will thread through every chapter of this story. Even as we examine the forensic details, the legal ramifications, and the timeline of events, we must never forget the human element. Grief, shock, betrayal, and the ripple effects of trauma are all part of this narrative. Romy Reiner's words give voice to these emotions, and they remind us that beyond the sensational headlines, there is real pain. Real people are suffering. Real lives have been irrevocably changed. Her courage in speaking out brings an emotional clarity that contrasts with the confusion and horror of the events themselves. By the time this video concludes, you will have an understanding not only of what happened, but why it matters. This is not just a story of murder. It is a story of trust violated, of family dynamics gone tragically wrong, and of the fragility of human relationships. And while the details are horrifying, they are essential for grasping the full impact of this tragedy. But even with all this, there is more to uncover. There are secrets that only surface under scrutiny, facts that shock, and details that completely reframe the story we think we know. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The Reiners were a family that, to the outside world, seemed flawless. Picture perfect even. Wealth, status, influence, they had it all. A sprawling Brentwood estate, expensive cars, luxury vacations, and a life many could only dream of. To neighbors and friends, they were the embodiment of success, a family who seemed to glide through life untroubled. But, as is often the case, appearances can be deceptive. Behind closed doors, the picture was far more complicated. The Reiners' public image was pristine. Their private reality, as we would soon learn, was layered with tension, secrets, and fractures that had been quietly forming over years. Rob Reiner, 78, was a man of stature, both literal and symbolic. A father, a husband, a figure whose life carried weight and history, Rob had always projected an air of stability. People admired him, trusted him, and believed in the safety of the life he curated. Michelle, his wife of decades, 70 years old and equally charismatic in her own way, provided warmth and continuity in the family dynamic. She was the anchor to Rob's intensity, the partner who balanced public appearances with the reality of maintaining a household that spanned generations. To outsiders, they were a unit that could not be broken, a picture of harmony. But what truly defines a family? Is it wealth? Social status? A curated image that leaves no room for cracks? Or is it something deeper, something invisible to outsiders? In the case of the Reiners, it appears the facade was only skin deep. Beneath it lay tension simmering quietly, unnoticed by most, and certainly underestimated by those outside the family's inner circle. Nick Reiner, their 32-year-old son, was the child at the center of this storm. On paper, he had every advantage: a privileged upbringing, access to education, exposure to wealth, and the guidance of parents who, by all accounts, loved him. Yet, there were signs that all was not well. While outsiders saw the Reiners as a cohesive, happy family, the undercurrents were subtle but persistent: small disagreements, unspoken resentments, moments that hinted at friction and unease. Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, has recently shed light on just how deep the fractures ran. Her words, raw and emotional, reveal a family struggling under pressures unseen by the public. Unimaginable pain, she said, her voice breaking. Horrific and devastating loss. She painted a picture of a household that, despite appearances, was riddled with fear, tension, and an inability to address conflict constructively. The Reiner family, for all its wealth and status, was not immune to dysfunction, and in some ways, that dysfunction would have catastrophic consequences. So why did no one see it coming? That is the question that lingers over this family's story. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Friends of the family described Rob and Michelle as devoted parents. Neighbors spoke of their grace and affability, and public perception painted a picture of stability. But when tragedy strikes, it often reveals the truth that the public cannot see: the cracks, the resentments, the secrets, and the underlying struggles that quietly define a family's reality. Consider this. How many families out there, seemingly perfect to the outside eye, harbor tensions that could erupt if circumstances align in the wrong way? What is it that drives these hidden fissures to suddenly become catastrophic events? In the case of the Reiners, the answer lies in a combination of personal histories, unresolved conflicts, and, perhaps most shockingly, the inner life of a son who ultimately became the instrument of destruction. To understand the tragedy that would unfold, we must look beyond the luxurious walls of the Brentwood estate. We must explore the psychology, the relationships, and the hidden dynamics that define the family. Every family has its story, but few are as intricate and layered as this one. The public only ever sees the exterior: the manicured lawns, the celebrations, the smiles on holidays. The private life, the arguments in the kitchen, the whispered disagreements, the tensions around money and inheritance, is far less visible. Yet, it is often here, in these private spaces, where the seeds of disaster are planted. Rob Reiner's stature, both as a parent and a public figure, created its own pressures. Expectations were high, not just for him, but for those around him. Michelle's role, equally significant, was to mediate and maintain harmony. The Reiners had cultivated a life that projected success, but within that structure were human beings with all the complexity and imperfection that comes with it. And Nick Reiner, their son, was at the center of this tension, a young man navigating the dual pressures of familial expectation and personal struggle. Family histories often leave invisible marks. Childhood memories, sibling dynamics, and parental expectations shape the adults we become. In many cases, families carry tensions across generations, never openly addressing them, believing that appearances matter more than confronting difficult truths. The Reiners were no exception. Each member had their role, their persona, and their private frustrations, all of which built slowly, quietly, until they reached a tipping point. It's tempting to ask, at this point, why it had to reach that tipping point. Could intervention have saved Rob and Michelle? Could friends, neighbors, or even distant relatives have noticed signs and acted sooner? These are questions without easy answers, but they are essential for understanding the depth of this tragedy. The cracks in the Reiner family were not visible to casual observers, yet the pressure beneath the surface was immense. And when tragedy struck, it did so in a way that left everyone asking how a family so admired could collapse so violently. Think about the duality of public versus private life. The Reiners, like many high-profile families, maintained an exterior designed to project normalcy and success. Yet inside, the pressures of family expectations, unresolved conflict, and individual struggles created a volatile environment. For decades, these tensions existed quietly, perhaps ignored, perhaps unrecognized. And then, one fateful day, The private realities collided with the public image in the most devastating way imaginable. As we explore the Reiner family further, we will examine the personalities, relationships, and events that led to the fatal night. We will dissect the last days of Rob and Michelle, explore the life and mindset of Nick Reiner, and understand Romy Reiner's perspective. The youngest daughter who witnessed, or at least became painfully aware of, the darkness that had been quietly growing. Each of these pieces contributes to a fuller picture of a family that, outwardly perfect, was internally fragile. And yet, even knowing this, it is impossible to prepare for the horror that unfolded. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of safety and stability, became the scene of unimaginable violence. The very people who should have been protectors, anchors, and sources of support were turned against in the most tragic way. And it was within this context, the intersection of wealth, family, secrecy, and violence, that the events of that Sunday must be understood. But the story does not end with the simple facts of tragedy. Each revelation uncovers deeper layers. Past tensions that explain the present, private struggles that contextualize the violence, and overlooked warning signs that, in retrospect, scream for attention. We will navigate these layers carefully, chapter by chapter, to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and how a family that appeared untouchable could be so profoundly vulnerable. So as we step into this story, ask yourself, how well do you really know the people closest to you? How much of what you see is a carefully curated exterior, hiding truths that no one else can perceive? The Reiner's story is a cautionary tale, a tragedy wrapped in a veneer of perfection, and a reminder that even the most admired families can harbor secrets capable of changing lives forever. And just when you think you understand the scope of the tragedy, just when you think the narrative is clear, what comes next will challenge everything you believe about trust, family, and betrayal. The events about to unfold are both shocking and instructive, and they will leave you questioning not only the Reiner's story, but the very nature of familial bonds themselves. Sunday. The day should have been ordinary, peaceful even. A quiet morning in Brentwood, sunlight spilling across manicured lawns, the faint hum of distant traffic barely audible behind the walls of the Reiner estate. For most families, Sundays are about rest, family meals, perhaps a lazy walk or coffee on the terrace. But for Rob and Michelle Reiner, that Sunday would become the backdrop for a nightmare no one could have imagined. It all started the evening before, on Saturday. According to sources close to the family, Rob and Michelle had been in good spirits initially, laughing over old stories, sharing memories from decades spent together, and tending to the estate's countless little details that only those who live in a grand home can understand. On the surface, there was no hint that the next day would descend into horror. Friends who had visited that weekend noted the couple's warmth, their attentiveness, their love for each other and their family. But appearances, as so often happens, were misleading. Behind the smiles and the laughter, tension lingered. Subtle, almost imperceptible. The kind of tension that grows in households where difficult conversations are postponed, where resentment simmers quietly, and where one member struggles in silence. Romy Reiner has hinted that these tensions had been escalating in recent weeks. Small disagreements that might seem insignificant to outsiders had, in fact, been cumulative. The Reiners were a family accustomed to appearances, and sometimes, appearances masked underlying struggles. On Sunday morning, things began as any normal Sunday might. Breakfast in the sunlit kitchen, soft conversations about the week ahead, and the usual tasks of managing a household of that size. But by late morning, a series of events began to unfold that would eventually lead to a tragedy beyond comprehension. It started with minor disturbances, small disagreements between Rob and Nick, the 32-year-old son who lived in the guest house. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices, though no one thought much of it at the time. In many families, occasional tension is normal, even expected. But in this instance, those disagreements were harbingers of something far darker. Nick had reportedly been struggling with personal issues for some time. While details are still emerging, those close to the family hinted at financial stress, emotional strain, and perhaps unresolved resentment toward his parents. It's not unusual for adult children to face friction with their parents, especially in wealthy families where expectations can feel suffocating. But the extent of that friction, coupled with personal instability, would prove to be deadly. Meanwhile, Rob and Michelle continued with their day, oblivious to the impending catastrophe. They went about their routines, managing household matters, making calls, and attending to family business. Romy, who was elsewhere that morning, later recounted that she had sensed something off, but didn't realize the severity. There's a chilling irony in this. Sometimes the warning signs are there, subtle as they may be, yet no one recognizes them until it is far too late. By mid-morning, reports suggest that interactions between Rob and Nick had escalated. Voices grew louder. Doors were slammed. In households under pressure, small conflicts can spiral rapidly when compounded by mental health struggles, underlying resentment, and a lack of open communication. It's unclear exactly what was said, but what is known is that something shifted in Nick's behavior that morning. Friends describe him as agitated, unpredictable, and increasingly isolated. The first critical moment occurred when Rob reportedly attempted to de-escalate the situation. A father, instinctively trying to maintain calm, to protect both his home and his son, he engaged in dialogue, hoping to steer the conversation away from confrontation. Michelle, too, tried to intervene, offering mediation, attempting to create a buffer that might prevent escalation. In many households, this approach is effective. In this one, tragically, it was not. At some point that morning, according to Romy's later testimony, Rob reached a breaking point. He realized that he might not be able to contain the situation alone. The fear, the sense of danger, began to register. And yet, even as the instinct to protect and reason kicked in, the events that followed could not be stopped. Neighbors have since recounted odd occurrences from that morning. Doors that were typically open remained closed. Lights flickered on and off, and there was a tension in the air that many described as palpable. In retrospect, these small signs were indicators of the brewing disaster, but at the time, no one could have predicted the magnitude of what was about to happen. Romy later revealed that, during this critical window, Rob called out for help. The words, "he begged me for help," would later shock the nation. Imagine the desperation in that statement. The knowledge that your father, a man who had lived a long life, who had faced countless challenges, was now pleading for intervention against a force that should never have existed within the family. This is a moment that defines the horror of the morning. A son, poised in proximity, and a father, pleading for rescue. And then, the violence began. The details, as they have emerged, are harrowing. Rob was stabbed multiple times. Accounts later confirmed that the number approached or exceeded 100. Michelle, too, was attacked, her life cut short in the same brutal manner. The very home that should have been a sanctuary became a scene of chaos, fear, and unimaginable suffering. The scale and ferocity of the violence cannot be overstated. Even those who had witnessed or investigated violent crime have described the scene as particularly brutal, particularly disturbing in its intimacy. At this point, the timeline becomes both crucial and chilling. Police later confirmed that the attack was rapid but sustained, leaving little room for escape or intervention. The Reiners' proximity to each other, the structure of the estate, and the initial hesitation of bystanders all contributed to the inability to stop the tragedy. And while law enforcement was eventually notified, the sequence of events had already passed the point of reversal. The question that haunts observers is simple but profound. What drove this escalation? Why did a family, appearing outwardly stable, collapse into such violent chaos in mere hours? The answer, it seems, lies in a combination of personal struggle, family tension, and unresolved emotional conflict. Nick Reiner's mental state, his relationship with his parents, and the pressures of living under the same roof as a father he may have resented or feared all converged on that fatal morning. Adding to the complexity is the human element. The shock, the disbelief, the trauma of witnessing a parent in peril, the fear of intervening, and the paralysis that can occur in moments of extreme danger. Romy Reiner's testimony underscores this element. Her recounting of her father begging for help is both heart-wrenching and illuminating. It speaks to the desperation, the immediacy, and the sheer terror of the morning. Even after the attack, the aftermath would be shocking. The Reiners' estate, once a symbol of wealth and security, became the center of a criminal investigation, media frenzy, and public speculation. Neighbors and friends would struggle to reconcile the peaceful, affluent facade of the home with the horror that had occurred within its walls. And for Romy, the youngest daughter, the grief and trauma were only beginning. But even in those last hours of life, there were signs of the humanity that made the tragedy so profound. Rob's instinct to plead for help, to attempt to protect and reason, underscores the tragic heroism of the day. Michelle's presence, her attempts to mediate and maintain calm, highlight the enduring love and commitment even in the face of mortal danger. These details remind us that tragedy is never simple. It is a collision of circumstances, emotions, and choices that together create something utterly devastating. By the end of that Sunday, the world had been irrevocably changed for the Reiners. 2 lives, full of history, love, and family connection, were brutally ended. The son who lived in the guest house was arrested, charged, and thrust into a legal and public maelstrom that would dominate headlines for months to come. And the youngest daughter, Romy, would be left to reconcile the unbearable grief with the shocking details she has courageously shared. As we move forward in this story, it is essential to remember that these last days were not defined solely by the act of violence. They were defined by the cumulative tensions, the small disagreements, the emotional undercurrents that set the stage for disaster. Understanding these last hours is crucial to comprehending not just the crime, but the psychology, the family dynamics, and the human tragedy at the heart of the Reiners' story. But even with this understanding, one question remains. If the warnings were there, if the signs were subtle but present, could anyone have intervened? Could the tragedy have been prevented? And what would the Reiners' lives and the public perception of their family look like today if just one decision had been different? The answers, as we will discover in the coming chapters, are as complex and layered as the family itself. And what happened in those final hours was only the beginning of a story that would shock not just their immediate circle, but the world. Nick Reiner, 32 years old, the youngest, or perhaps the middle child in a family that outwardly seemed perfect. To outsiders, he was simply a son, a young man living in the guest house of a sprawling $13.5 million Brentwood estate. But behind the carefully curated images and public appearances, Nick's story was far more complex. The world would soon learn the horrifying role he played in the deaths of his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner. Yet to understand the full weight of that tragedy, we must first understand him. On the surface, Nick appeared to have every advantage. He grew up in a household that, from the outside, represented success and stability, wealth, opportunity, education, and a family with influence, the kind of privileges that many people would envy. And yet, history shows us that privilege is no safeguard against internal conflict, emotional turmoil, or psychological strain. In Nick's case, those undercurrents would prove fatal. Nick's life in the guest house may have seemed separate from the main household, but psychologically, the proximity was significant. Living so close to his parents meant constant interaction, constant exposure to the family dynamic, and no real escape from the pressures of expectation. Friends described him as quiet, often reserved, but also intensely private. There were moments of charm and humor, a young man capable of warmth, yet at times distant, withdrawn, and, some would later report, increasingly agitated. It's essential to consider the pressures Nick faced in this environment. Family dynamics in affluent households are rarely simple. Expectations, whether spoken or unspoken, can weigh heavily. In Nick's case, these pressures intersected with personal struggles. While many details remain private, sources close to the family indicate that Nick had faced ongoing challenges, emotional, financial, and possibly psychological, that may have contributed to the tension that escalated into violence. Friends and acquaintances described him as someone who had difficulty navigating conflict. Small disagreements, often insignificant to outsiders, sometimes triggered disproportionate responses. In many families, this can be mitigated by communication and support systems. In the Reiners' case, however, those systems appear to have been strained. Parents who may have expected obedience or understanding, children grappling with personal frustrations, and the weight of legacy all created an environment where conflict could fester unchecked. Nick's relationship with his parents, particularly his father, was complicated. Rob, as a patriarch, had clear expectations, both overt and subtle, about how his household should function and how his children should behave. Michelle, on the other hand, was often the mediator, attempting to maintain harmony where tension threatened to disrupt it. But when mediation fails, and when pressures accumulate without resolution, small grievances can escalate into profound conflict. In examining Nick's role, it's impossible to ignore the psychological dimensions. Experts later consulted on the case suggested that long-standing resentment, feelings of inadequacy, or perceived slights may have compounded over time. The isolation of living in the guest house, the proximity to wealth and expectation, and unresolved interpersonal tensions created a volatile combination. For Nick, the pressure may have been internalized in ways that were not visible to the family, neighbors, or friends, until it erupted into violence. Friends report that in the days leading up to the tragedy, Nick had shown signs of agitation. Minor irritations seemed to spiral into larger disputes. He became increasingly withdrawn, and those around him noticed a growing intensity in his demeanor. Small comments, offhand remarks, and the occasional argument hinted at frustration, but no one anticipated the scale of what was about to occur. This raises an essential question. How often do we miss the signs of internal struggle, even when those we know best are right in front of us? Social media and community accounts later revealed a young man who was active online, connected, yet isolated in his real-world relationships. The disconnect between public engagement and private turmoil is not uncommon, but in Nick's case, it may have served to mask the severity of his inner conflict. To those outside the family, he appeared typical, perhaps even charming, intelligent, capable, but behind closed doors, he was a man struggling with emotions and pressures that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. Rob Reiner's words cast a stark light on Nick's actions. "He begged me for help," she said of her father. This statement, repeated in news reports and social media commentary, underscores a critical truth. Nick was not just a passive participant in family tension. He became the instrument of an unimaginable act. The question of how someone so trusted, so close, could commit such a violent act is central to understanding both the personal and psychological dimensions of this tragedy. Nick's upbringing, while privileged, was not immune to complexity. Every family has its dynamics, its conflicts, its expectations, and its unspoken rules. In wealthy or high-profile households, these pressures are often magnified by public scrutiny, social reputation, and the weight of legacy. For Nick, living within the sphere of both privilege and expectation may have contributed to feelings of inadequacy, frustration, or resentment that were ultimately catastrophic. Yet, as disturbing as this is, it is important to approach the story with nuance. Nick was not merely a villain. He was a human being trapped in a web of circumstances, emotions, and family dynamics that spiraled out of control. Understanding him requires examining not just the act itself, but the personality, history, and environment that shaped him. Without this perspective, we risk reducing a profoundly complex tragedy to simplistic terms, ignoring the deeper truths that make this story so compelling and so devastating. The timing of Nick's escalation is also significant. That fatal Sunday morning was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of months, perhaps years, of tension, miscommunication, and unresolved conflict. The Reiners' family structure, the proximity of living spaces, and the pressures of legacy all contributed to the conditions that allowed this tragedy to unfold. The attack itself, brutal and unthinkable, was the endpoint of a long trajectory that few outside the family could perceive. Psychologists have noted that in many cases of familial violence, warning signs often exist but go unrecognized or dismissed. Small incidents, seemingly minor disagreements, can escalate when compounded by emotional instability, perceived injustices, or long-standing grievances. For Nick Reiner, these factors converged in ways that ultimately led to the deaths of his parents. The story, tragic as it is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of unresolved tension, communication breakdowns, and the hidden struggles that may exist even in families that appear perfect from the outside. As law enforcement pieced together the events of that Sunday, it became clear that Nick's actions were deliberate, sustained, and deeply personal. The brutality of the attack, multiple stab wounds inflicted on both parents, speaks to more than a momentary lapse of control. It reflects an eruption of emotion, a breakdown of familial bonds, and the culmination of unresolved psychological and emotional pressures. The arrest that followed was swift, but the questions about motive, intent, and underlying causes remain complex and multifaceted. Nick's life, once defined by the privileges and expectations of his family, is now defined by one horrific act. The legal process will explore his culpability, his intent, and the circumstances that led to the tragedy. But beyond legal questions, there is the human story, the betrayal, the grief, the shock, and the ripple effects that will impact family members, friends, and the wider community for years to come. Rob Reiner, in her statement, captures the emotional weight of this reality. The son who was trusted, the young man who lived in proximity to love and support, became the source of devastating pain. Her grief is compounded not only by the loss of her parents, but also by the realization that a family member was responsible for the unthinkable. This duality, love intertwined with betrayal, is a core theme of the Reiner story, one that will resonate throughout every chapter we explore. Even as the legal case unfolds, the personal dimensions remain unresolved. Nick's actions have forever altered the Reiner family dynamic, shattered trust, and left questions that may never have clear answers. How could someone so close commit such an act? Were there missed warning signs, moments where intervention could have prevented tragedy? And how does a family reconcile with a reality in which the perpetrator is also a loved one? These questions are central to understanding both the human and psychological aspects of the Reiner tragedy. As we move to the next chapter, the focus will shift to the day of discovery, the moment the world first learned of the horror inside the Reiner estate. But before that, one truth must be acknowledged. Nick Reiner, the son everyone trusted, was at the center of a storm that would destroy not just lives, but the very fabric of the family itself. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The morning that Rob and Michelle Reiner were found dead began, to outsiders, like any other Sunday. Birds chirped in the manicured gardens of the Brentwood estate. Sunlight filtered through the windows, highlighting the sprawling living spaces that had become synonymous with wealth and stability. To the casual observer, the estate was a symbol of safety, a fortress that protected its occupants from the dangers of the outside world. But that Sunday, the walls that once symbolized security would become the silent witnesses to unspeakable horror. The discovery of the crime was, in many ways, as shocking as the act itself. Early reports from neighbors indicate that some sensed something was wrong before law enforcement even arrived. Doors that were normally open remained shut. The usual quiet hum of activity was replaced by an eerie stillness, and the absence of Rob and Michelle in the public eye raised subtle alarms. Yet, no one could have imagined the scale of what had occurred within those walls. At first, the initial response came from household staff and security personnel who had access to the estate. Their concern was routine, checking on the family, ensuring everything was as expected. But as they approached the main house, the sense of unease intensified. The first signs of disturbance were subtle: a door slightly ajar, personal belongings in disarray, a faint, inexplicable tension in the air. It was as if the home itself was signaling that something had gone terribly wrong. The formal discovery occurred when authorities were called to the estate. Police reports later described the scene in clinical terms, but even these could not fully convey the horror of what they encountered. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, had been attacked with brutal force. Multiple stab wounds, inflicted with such ferocity and repetition that the scene suggested both rage and intent. This was not a momentary lapse or a spontaneous act. It was a deliberate, sustained, and intimate assault that left no room for misinterpretation. The forensic evidence painted a grim picture. Rob was stabbed over 100 times, each wound a testament to the violence and intensity of the attack. Michelle, too, suffered multiple fatal wounds. The sheer number and nature of the injuries indicated a level of aggression and proximity that is rarely seen in criminal cases. In many ways, the brutality of the attack underscored the deeply personal nature of the crime. This was not random. This was someone close, someone with access, someone with knowledge of the victim's routines and vulnerabilities. As police processed the scene, they began piecing together the sequence of events. Interviews with neighbors revealed fragmented observations, a heated argument the previous day, voices raised in the early morning hours, doors opening and closing with unusual frequency. While these accounts were incomplete, they contributed to a growing understanding of the tension that had been building within the Reiner household. For Romy Reiner, the discovery was devastating on both a personal and emotional level. She later recounted the initial shock of learning what had occurred, describing the moment with raw clarity, the disbelief, the horror, and the impossible task of reconciling the image of her parents with the brutal reality of their deaths. Her grief was compounded by the knowledge that her brother, Nick, was implicated. The duality of sorrow and betrayal became a defining feature of her public statements, providing insight into the complex emotional landscape of a family torn apart by violence. Media coverage of the discovery quickly intensified. Reporters arrived at the estate, social media buzzed with speculation, and the story spread rapidly across national and international outlets. The juxtaposition of the luxurious Brentwood setting with the brutal crime scene captured public attention. People were captivated not just by the act of violence, but by the seeming impossibility that it could occur in such a setting, to a family that appeared outwardly stable and respected. Even within law enforcement, the case was unusual in its severity and intimacy. The investigators were dealing not only with a high-profile family, but with the psychological complexity of a crime committed within the household. The focus quickly shifted to Nick Reiner, whose proximity and relationship to the victims made him the primary suspect. Arrest procedures were swift, but the emotional and procedural complexity of the case was immense. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances struggled to reconcile the image of Rob and Michelle with the reality of the crime. Many described the couple as kind, generous, and loving, while others hinted at underlying tensions within the family. These conflicting perceptions illustrate a core element of the tragedy: the public facade versus private reality. The Reiners, like many families, maintained a veneer of perfection, yet beneath it lay the tensions, disagreements, and psychological pressures that contributed to the catastrophic events. Forensic analysis also revealed other details that heightened the shock of the crime. The scene suggested premeditation and knowledge of the home's layout, indicating that the perpetrator was familiar with the environment and the routines of the victims. This familiarity would later point investigators toward Nick as the primary suspect, solidifying the narrative of familial betrayal that would dominate public discourse. In the hours following the discovery, the estate became a focal point for law enforcement, media, and public attention. The juxtaposition of the serene, affluent neighborhood with the violence that had occurred within its walls created a sense of disbelief and fascination. The narrative was not merely one of crime. It was a story of trust violated, of family bonds shattered, and of the unpredictable potential for tragedy in even the most seemingly secure environments. The emotional weight of discovery was compounded by Romy's response. She spoke publicly, sharing the depth of her grief and the unimaginable pain of losing both parents in such a violent manner. Her description of her father pleading for help adds a human dimension to the clinical and procedural aspects of the discovery. This was not just a crime scene. It was a site of human suffering, terror, and betrayal. As investigators continued their work, it became clear that the case would not be straightforward. Every piece of evidence, every witness account, and every statement from family members contributed to a narrative that was both tragic and complex. The discovery of the crime was only the beginning. Understanding the how, the why, and the human dimensions of what transpired required delving deeper into the lives, personalities, and dynamics of the Reiner family. But even at this stage, one truth was undeniable. The Reiners were a family that had been violently torn apart from within. The safety, stability, and order that the estate represented were illusions shattered in a single morning. And while law enforcement moved to secure the scene and gather evidence, the emotional and psychological impact on those closest to the victims, especially Romy, was just beginning to unfold. The discovery of Rob and Michelle's deaths forced everyone to confront uncomfortable realities. How could such violence occur within the walls of a home that should have been safe? How could a son, someone entrusted with the family's care, become the perpetrator of such horrific acts? And perhaps most haunting of all, what signs had been missed, ignored, or dismissed that might have prevented this tragedy? The answers would emerge slowly, chapter by chapter, as investigators pieced together the events leading up to that fateful morning. Yet even as the evidence accumulated, the human element remained undeniable. The grief, the betrayal, and the emotional devastation that would ripple through the family and the broader community for years to come. And just when the world thought it had grasped the horror of the situation, the revelations from Rob Reiner and the unfolding investigation into Nick would shock even those who had followed the story closely. The world had been watching the Reiners with a mixture of fascination and disbelief since the horrific events at their Brentwood estate. Headlines flashed across screens, social media exploded with speculation, and the names of Rob, Michelle, and Nick Reiner became etched into public consciousness. Yet amidst the chaos, there was one voice that carried a rawness and authenticity no report or tweet could capture. Rob Reiner, the youngest daughter, whose grief was as profound as it was public. When Romy first spoke to the media, she did so not as a celebrity, not as a figure in a high-profile family, but as a daughter enduring the unimaginable. Her voice, trembling and raw, carried with it the weight of loss and the sharp edge of betrayal. She revealed what no one outside the family could have imagined. "He begged me for help," she said, referring to her father, Rob. Those words, simple yet devastating, encapsulated the horror of that day. They conveyed not only the violence itself, but the helplessness, the desperation, and the emotional fracture caused by familial betrayal. Romy's statement went beyond recounting facts. She allowed the world to see the emotional reality behind the crime. Every word was a window into a daughter's pain, a family's brokenness, and the trauma of watching loved ones fall victim to a violence that should never exist within the sanctity of home. Her grief was palpable, and her courage in speaking publicly underscored a commitment to truth, even when the truth was unbearably painful. The impact of her words was immediate. Social media lit up with reactions. Some expressed sympathy, others shock, and many struggled to comprehend the scale of what she was describing. The notion that a father, a man of 78, had been stabbed over 100 times, that he had pleaded for help, was beyond the realm of ordinary understanding. Romy's testimony provided a human connection to an otherwise surreal narrative, anchoring the tragedy in emotions everyone could recognize: fear, loss, and heartbreak. In her interviews, Romy did not shy away from the most difficult aspects of the story. She spoke of the horror, the grief, and the questions that haunted her. How could this happen? Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? Every word carried the weight of someone processing a trauma that was both intimate and public. Her willingness to speak publicly also highlighted another critical aspect: the importance of acknowledgement in the grieving process. By naming the events, by confronting the reality of her parents' deaths, Romy was reclaiming a sense of agency in a situation where control had been violently stripped away. But Romy's statements also revealed the complexities of family dynamics. She did not merely describe the violence. She spoke to the underlying fractures, the tensions, and the unseen struggles that had quietly existed within the Reiner household. These were the hidden layers, the subtle conflicts, the emotional distances, the moments of unspoken resentment that had shaped her brother's actions and set the stage for tragedy. By illuminating these realities, Romy offered the public a deeper understanding of not only the crime itself, but the human and psychological forces that can escalate to unimaginable outcomes. One of the most striking elements of Romy's account was her focus on immediacy and proximity. She recounted, in vivid detail, the moments when her father reached out, when he sought help, when the violence became unmistakable. The specificity of her recollections served two purposes. First, to convey the depth of the tragedy in human terms, and second, to highlight the betrayal inherent in a family member becoming the agent of such violence. For many observers, this duality was almost impossible to reconcile. the son, the brother, the family member, was also the perpetrator. Romy's perspective also shed light on her own position within the family dynamic. As the youngest daughter, she was both observer and participant, caught between grief for her parents and the complex emotions surrounding her brother. Her reflections revealed the delicate balance of love, fear, and confusion that defines many families in crisis, amplified in her case by the extreme circumstances. The interplay of these emotions created a narrative that was as psychologically compelling as it was tragic. Her interviews also prompted broader societal questions about familial violence. How often do warning signs go unnoticed in families? How can internal conflicts escalate to such extreme outcomes? What role do privilege, expectation, and emotional pressure play in shaping outcomes within ostensibly stable households? Romy's courage in speaking out gave these questions a human face, grounding abstract discussions in lived experience and raw emotion. Furthermore, Romy's public statements served to reclaim the narrative. In a situation dominated by speculation, rumors, and sensationalized headlines, her voice was a stabilizing force. It reminded the world that behind every shocking statistic, every gruesome detail, there are real people enduring trauma, navigating grief, and attempting to make sense of a senseless tragedy. Her words were not just testimony. They were a plea for understanding, a testament to the enduring complexity of family bonds, and a recognition of the deep emotional consequences of violence. The public response to Romy's revelations was mixed but overwhelmingly empathetic. Audiences connected with her humanity, her honesty, and her willingness to confront a truth that was both personal and universally unsettling. She became the emotional center of the story, the lens through which the world could begin to understand the scale of loss, betrayal, and psychological devastation that had occurred. Yet even as Romy spoke, new questions emerged. Observers began to wonder about the unseen factors. The family tensions that had gone unresolved, the interactions between Nick and his parents in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, and the mental and emotional state that could lead a son to commit such a violent act. Romy's testimony opened the door to these inquiries, providing a foundation for deeper exploration into the circumstances that led to the fatal Sunday. Importantly, Romy also conveyed the enduring love she felt for her parents. Amid the horror and grief, her statements reflected a profound reverence for their lives and the family they had built. This emotional complexity, grief intertwined with respect and love, added a dimension often overlooked in discussions of crime. That even in the face of betrayal, human bonds and affection endure, shaping the way we process trauma and loss. By the end of her first public statement, one truth was undeniable. Rob Reiner had become both a witness and a narrator, providing clarity in a situation clouded by violence, fear, and confusion. Her words would guide much of the public's understanding of the tragedy, framing the narrative in emotional, human terms while also hinting at the psychological and familial complexities beneath the surface. Her courage in speaking out, in sharing the intimate and horrific details of her father's final moments, transformed the story from a sensational headline into a profoundly human tragedy. It reminded the world that crimes within families carry an emotional weight that cannot be measured by statistics or news coverage alone. Every detail she revealed, the pleas for help, the violence, the betrayal, served as a stark reminder that the most shocking acts of violence often occur in the spaces we consider safest. But even as Romy gave voice to her grief, the story was far from over. Behind the statements, interviews, and public revelations, there were still unanswered questions. The investigation into Nick's motives, the sequence of events leading to the attack, and the broader psychological and familial context were only beginning to unfold. Romy's bravery in speaking out set the stage for these deeper explorations, preparing the public to confront truths that would be as unsettling as they were compelling. And as the investigation continued, as law enforcement, psychologists, and family members pieced together the layers of this tragedy, it became clear that Romy's revelations were only the beginning. The story of the Reiners was far from complete, and what was about to emerge would shock even those who had followed the story closely. The moment Rob and Michelle Reiner were discovered, the gears of law enforcement sprang into motion. The scene at the Brentwood estate was not just a crime scene. It was a high-profile, emotionally charged epicenter of chaos. Police officers, detectives, forensic teams, and crime scene investigators arrived swiftly, each tasked with piecing together a sequence of events that had resulted in one of the most shocking familial tragedies in recent memory. But the investigation would prove far from straightforward. From the outset, authorities faced a complex landscape. The crime was intimate, brutal, and deeply personal. Over 100 stab wounds had been inflicted on Rob alone, a level of violence that suggested more than momentary rage. Michelle's injuries mirrored the brutality, pointing to a sustained, deliberate attack. Investigators knew immediately that this was not a random act of violence. This was a calculated, personal assault, one executed by someone who knew the victims intimately and understood the layout of the estate. The question was no longer if they knew the perpetrator, it was who and why. Nick Reiner, living in the guest house on the property, quickly became the focal point of the investigation. His proximity to the victims, combined with the timing and nature of the attack, placed him squarely under scrutiny. Yet even as authorities zeroed in on him, they had to carefully gather evidence, ensuring every detail was documented and verified. Forensic teams meticulously photographed the scene, collected DNA samples, and analyzed every potential clue. The goal was clear: build a factual timeline that could withstand both public scrutiny and the rigors of the legal system. As investigators began to piece together the last moments of Rob and Michelle, early interviews painted a disturbing picture. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices, unusual movement, and other subtle signs of tension, yet no one suspected a tragedy of this magnitude. Family, friends, and acquaintances described the Reiners as outwardly stable, loving, and seemingly harmonious. The dissonance between perception and reality became a key focus for investigators. What signs, if any, had hinted at the brewing storm inside the Reiner household? The initial investigation relied heavily on forensic evidence. The number of stab wounds, the positioning of the bodies, and the trajectory of the attacks suggested a highly emotional, sustained engagement. It was clear that this was not a crime of impulse, but a carefully executed act fueled by a personal vendetta, rage, or some combination of both. Experts later explained that the pattern of injuries indicated intense emotional involvement, the type of violence most commonly committed by someone with deep familiarity and unresolved conflict with the victims. Authorities also began scrutinizing the family's history, interactions, and dynamics. Financial records, communications, and prior disputes were examined in an attempt to understand potential motives. Was this a spontaneous eruption of anger? Or was it the culmination of years of tension, unaddressed resentment, and psychological strain? Early evidence suggested the latter, pointing to a complex interplay of personal and familial factors that had quietly escalated into catastrophe. Nick's mental state became a critical area of investigation. Interviews with friends, acquaintances, and family members painted a picture of a man experiencing emotional strain and isolation. While none of these factors excuse the crime, they provide essential context for understanding how a seemingly ordinary son could become the perpetrator of such an extreme act. Authorities sought to determine whether prior signs of instability or aggression had been present and whether any intervention could have prevented the tragedy. At the same time, investigators worked to reconstruct the timeline of the fatal Sunday. By piecing together phone records, security footage, and eyewitness accounts, they began to create a minute-by-minute narrative of the events leading up to the deaths. This painstaking process was essential for both the legal case and for understanding the human elements of the tragedy. Each new piece of information added nuance. Small disagreements that escalated, moments of pleading for help, and ultimately, the catastrophic sequence of violence that claimed Rob and Michelle's lives. The media, of course, amplified every development. Headlines splashed Nick's name across news outlets. Speculation ran rampant on social media, and armchair detectives dissected every available detail. Law enforcement had to balance transparency with caution, providing enough information to assure the public while safeguarding the integrity of the investigation. Every revelation had potential consequences, both legally and socially, and the weight of public scrutiny added an additional layer of complexity to an already difficult case. Meanwhile, Rob Reiner's public statements continued to influence the investigation indirectly. Her testimony provided emotional context that reinforced the forensic and circumstantial evidence. Her account of her father pleading for help underscored the intimate and personal nature of the crime, aligning with what investigators observed at the scene. Romy became a bridge between the public perception and the investigative reality, giving the story a deeply human dimension that went beyond the crime itself. As the investigation unfolded, authorities also explored potential triggers. Financial disputes, inheritance questions, unresolved family tensions, and possible mental health concerns were all analyzed to determine whether they had contributed to the eruption of violence. The complexity of these factors made the investigation challenging. Unlike straightforward cases where motive and opportunity are clear, this situation involved a web of emotional, psychological, and relational elements that had evolved over years, culminating in one devastating day. Interviews with neighbors added further texture to the case. They described a household that was, on the surface, calm and orderly, yet subtly marked by underlying tension. The contrast between public appearances and private reality became increasingly stark. Investigators began to appreciate the difficulty of detecting warning signs in families where appearances mask internal struggles. It was a lesson in human behavior, one that underscores the tragedy. Sometimes the most severe conflicts remain invisible until they explode. The law enforcement strategy was multifaceted. Forensic analysis continued to confirm the sequence and method of the attacks, while detectives interviewed anyone connected to the family to piece together a psychological profile of the perpetrator. Behavioral experts were consulted to understand Nick's potential motives, mental state, and triggers. Every conversation, every piece of evidence, and every observation contributed to a slowly forming picture of a man whose actions had shattered his family. As days turned into weeks, the investigation deepened. Authorities discovered more about the Reiners' daily life.